Dr. Michael Mann, welcome to the show. Welcome to Naked Passion Podcast. An absolute pleasure to have you on the show, mate. So thank you very much for making the time.
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be with you here today.
So for those just joining us, we had a bit of technical difficulties, but we've got Dr. Mann now. So just to do the formalities, Dr. Mann, so Presidential Distinguished Professor and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability and the Media at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Michael Mann, again, welcome to the show. So let's jump straight into it. I'm obviously appreciative of your time. I'll jump into one of my favorite parts of the show, Dr. Mann, is the two truths and a lie. So we'll jump straight into that. So your two truths and a lie, and I'd just like to sort of highlight Heather on your team she's been sensational, Dr. Mann. So she's back and forward a few emails. She's absolutely brilliant.
Absolutely.
So the two truths and a lie for yourself. So I'm hoping you know the answer to this. But number one, I've interviewed Debbie Harry of the band Blondie about climate change. Number two, I've performed with Taylor Swift. And number three, if you name a song, I can play it on the piano. So I'm going to go process of elimination here. Based on your illustrious career, I'm going to say climate change. I'm going to say you have interviewed Debbie Harry of the great band Blondie. So I'm going to say that's the truth. I'm going to say that if I name a song, you can play it on piano. I'm going to say the lie would be that you performed with Taylor Swift. How did I go?
Sorry, you're wrong. I was on the Eras tour with last week, but no, you're right. Actually, I was with my wife and daughter as I was sort of deciding which questions, the truths and lies, and they said it was way too obvious, way too easy. My daughter's a Swiftie, so that's part of why I had that there.
I love that. I love that. My co-CEO is actually a big Swiftie herself, so shout out to Sally. But have you got a favorite song, Dr. Mann, or is it more your daughter's domain?
Oh, it's funny. I have lots of songs I like, from different eras. No pun intended there. But my daughter gets a kick out of the fact that I like Harry Styles, As It Was. I have on sort of my playlist for traveling, driving, that sort of stuff. So yeah.
I like it. All right, and you've also got a book coming out called Our Fragile Moment: How Lessons from Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis. So look, I've got a couple of questions out the gate, but I guess just to get on the front foot with that, Dr. Mann, where would you like to take the narrative at the moment as far as the idea in and around climate change?
Yeah, so my last book, the New Climate War, was really about the challenges we face now that the impacts of climate change have become obvious to the person on the street. And that's clearly true in Australia. I was down there. I lived through the Black Summer with my Australian friends there. And so, I know Australians have seen the impacts firsthand. We're seeing that here this summer. We're having our Black Summer across the United States. I'm sure your listeners have been watching with horror what's taking place in Maui, but Canada is up in flames. And so it's very difficult to deny that climate change is happening, that we're warming the planet and impacting our world in a very profound way now. But that doesn't mean fossil fuel interests and polluters have given up. They've just sort of shifted their tactics. And ironically, one of the tactics is to sort of fan the flames of doomism. Like if we become convinced it's truly too late to do anything, that the climate's spinning out of control and nothing we do can make a difference, it potentially leads us down that same path of disengagement as denial. And so I had increasingly noticed that sort of widespread doomism and despair was sort of almost replacing denial as the major sort of impediment to action. And so I decided to sort of return to my roots, which is paleoclimate, the study of past climates, probably my best known scientific contribution is the so-called hockey stick curve that shows how profound the warming of the last century is, in the context of the past 1,000 years. And so it was sort of my bread and butter as a scientist. Where I started out was really the science of paleoclimate. And what I was finding was that science was now being misrepresented to sort of promote a narrative of doom. For example, past warming periods associated with mass extinctions. There is this idea that was because of runaway release of methane from the melting permafrost. And once that happens, there's nothing we can do about it. And I was seeing paleoclimate and some of these past sort of mass extinctions used as sort of a template for the idea that we face doom today, that we are now sort of insured, to go extinct in a matter of years. So the idea was really to review the lessons that the paleoclimate record, that Earth's climate history really has for us, and unpack what it actually says. And, there are certainly times when we have seen both warming and other changes in the climate present, challenges to living things, and there have been mass extinctions. But there's also evidence of sort of a certain amount of resilience within the climate system when we look at how it evolved over billions of years. So the theme that sort of emerges is there's this sort of tussle between resilience and fragility, that the climate system exhibits both, and they're examples of both. And when we take in everything it has to tell us, sort of tells us that, we've got some margin of error. If we get our act together, if we reduce carbon emissions dramatically over the next decade, if we prevent the planet from exceeding, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming, we can prevent the worst impacts. We can prevent any sort of, mass extinction, runaway warming, what have you. If we continue with business as usual, if we fail to take meaningful action, then some of these, worst case scenarios suddenly do sort of find themselves on the table. And so it's up to us. As I like to say, there's urgency, but there's agency. We can still make a difference.
Well, what do you find? And it's interesting. There's lots to unpack there, right? I guess my question, and it's one thing that I guess as a layman, let's call it, you hear a lot of armchair scientists point to the time frame that is being, I guess, the narrative built around, at least from the media traditionally. And I think your work, to your point, is more based around a much longer time frame as far as the Earth as a whole. So the interesting thing at the moment, and the second thing that comes to mind,
how those things, yeah.
How do you measure it? And I guess the traditional, to still, man, the opposite side, at least their debate against the climate change narrative has always been, well, the Earth will always have seasons, hot, cold, that sort of stuff, ice age. So I guess what is the correct time frame to be judging this on, if there is one?
Yeah, it's a great question. These longer time frames sort of inform our discussion of this shorter time frame, because the governing factors are the same in a sense. Past episodes of rapid warming, and by rapid, I mean on geological timescales. Rapid warming on a geological timescale is over several thousand years. Rapid warming today is over decades. And so the timescale is dramatically different, but the drivers are similar. Releases of carbon dioxide, either naturally from changes in volcanic activity over millions of years in the past, or due to us today. And so the real difference is is not so much the magnitude, but the rate of change. We're taking all this carbon that nature buried under the ground over 100 million years since the time of the dinosaurs. And we're releasing it back into the atmosphere, but not over 100 million years. We're doing that over 100 years, 1 million times faster. And that's really where the uncertainty lies. The rates of change are unprecedented as far back as we can go in the paleoclimate record. That having been said, we can look at that record, for example, to estimate how sensitive the climate system is to a release of carbon into the atmosphere. How much warming can we expect if we double the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? The paleoclimate record can inform the answers to that question. It's an uncertain quantity, and climate models estimate different amounts of warming because they don't really agree on this so-called climate sensitivity. Different models respond differently because the things like clouds are represented differently, and that makes a difference. And so we have this relatively short historical record. A whole bunch of things are going on, and there's a whole bunch of uncertainty in the models. Yeah. What studying the past does is it gives us a variety of complementary lines of evidence that help pin that down. And it turns out the evidence, when we look at sort of past episodes of natural warming, or even the cooling during the last ice age, or sort of the trend in climate over billions of years as the sun gradually got brighter, but greenhouse gases, their concentrations actually dropped in such a way as to keep the temperature relatively constant. Why is that true? Why does the climate system act that way? Well, I won't give the answer to that mystery, but that's one of the things that we get into. But if you take all the evidence together, it tells us that the range predicted by the models looks about right. The models more or less are predicting correctly how much warming we can expect to get if we continue to pollute the atmosphere with carbon pollution. And so we can sort of rule out those worst case scenarios because the evidence from the past doesn't support this idea that we are due for a massive release of methane and a runaway warming scenario. The evidence doesn't support that. The truth, as my good friend and mentor, Steve Schneider, who sadly passed away some years ago, used to say, the truth is bad enough. And the truth is that as long as we continue to emit carbon into the atmosphere, the planet will continue to warm up steadily. And that's a problem. That's generating these devastating extreme weather events that we're seeing that we've seen down in Australia, that I saw when I was there for the Black Summer, and that I'm seeing now up here in the Northern Hemisphere this summer.
Yeah. Okay. If I got to give you if I was able to give you a magic notepad and you could write down the perfect situation as far as alternatives to I guess global energies, there's a lot of alternatives at the moment. What would you point to as the best guess, I guess, moving forward as to where we should focus our attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Australia, in a sense, sort of leads the way there. If we look at what's going on in South Australia, where there's just massive deployment of solar along with storage, it's sort of, I think South Australia is sort of a success story that speaks to the rest of the world that you can do it. Even in a country like Australia, which has had very entrenched fossil fuel interests, who have had quite a bit of impact on the media framing, Murdoch's media empire. Yes. Even in Australia, where there's been all of that opposition, much of it fueled by the Murdoch media empire and fossil fuel interests, we have this amazing success story. My friend Malcolm Turnbull, your former prime minister, is very supportive of Snowy Mountain hydro, pumped hydro. So we've got all these options. We've got solar, we've got pumped hydro, we've got wind. The solution is right in front of us, right? You hear, oh, well, there's just no way that we can transition our economy. It's not true. We have the technology now. The technology isn't the impediment. The impediment right now is the politics. And again, Australia really demonstrates that, under the Morrison, regime, there was widespread opposition. Now, with sort of Labor's, Labor, Albanese. Did I get that right?
Albanese. Yep.
Albanese. I always get it wrong. Albanese. Albanese government. is and I know some critics want to see them do more. There's still, been allowances for additional fossil fuel infrastructure. We're not there yet, but it was a sea change, and the new administration embraces this idea that we do have to transition off fossil fuels to renewable energy, and has put forward meaningful targets, after Australia was sort of the skunk at the garden party under the Morrison government, coming in, to the conference of the parties, the UN climate summit, and basically saying, Australia, we're not going to do anything. Well, now Australia is back sort of in a leadership position, but I know a lot of my friends there would like to see the Albanese government do more. So, and there's a reminder there, right? Even when you think your friends are in power, you need to put pressure on them, because there's so much pressure coming from the fossil fuel industry. There's so much funding, there's so much lobbying, that even though those politicians we might think are friends, won't necessarily do the right thing if there isn't equal and opposite pressure coming from us, from everyone else.
And that's such an interesting point. I mean, you look at someone's, I guess, what are they measured on? If you show me what they're measured on, you'll probably see where they're going to land. So as you've sort of alluded to there, what is the relationship, I guess, between policy and public perception, and then obviously the scientific community? Like, what is that relationship, and is it aligned, and how do we get there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and there is this huge gap right now between where the science and the scientists are. If you talk to any serious scientist in my field, they'll tell you there's no uncertainty about the fact that we're warming the planet with carbon pollution, and a lot of these, devastating impacts that we're seeing, they're what we predicted decades ago. It's the worst possible thing, for a climate scientist. Most scientists like to see their predictions verified. Climate scientists don't. We don't want to see our predictions verified because of the implications that has. It means that we're watching our predictions come true because we didn't see policymakers take the actions necessary when we could have decades ago to prevent the devastating consequences we're already seeing. And so there is this disconnect, right, between scientific opinion, which is overwhelming, and public opinion, where the public still somewhat split. I think increasingly in Australia, here in the US, the public's come a long ways, primarily because we're seeing this stuff with our own two eyes. I was living in Sydney during the Black Summer. I could smell the smoke. I could see it when I stepped outside the door of the apartment at Coogee that I was living in. I was watching this happen. And so, that, but there has been so much misinformation and disinformation promoted by the fossil fuel industry. And again, in Australia, where, the Murdoch media empire has such a stranglehold. And I know there's an interesting discussion. I participated in a parliamentary hearing on media diversity, this recognition that there need to be consequences when, for the bad, actions that have been, taken, the misinformation that has been promoted by, Murdoch, and the consequences, right? The fact that we're witnessing these devastating impacts is in part because of, the Murdoch media empire and the impact that they have had worldwide here in the US in the form of Fox News, the Wall Street Journal. They have clouded public perception for decades, and they have prevented us from acting decades ago. So, if you ask me, people like Rupert Murdoch are guilty of not just a crime against humanity, something even larger, a crime against the planet. It's the greatest possible sort of crime that one can imagine. Finally, I think we're seeing some consequences. And I read some headlines recently that financially, they've taken a huge hit in Australia, News Corp, because I think people have caught on. People have caught it. You fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I think Australians are smarter than that, and I think they've caught on.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you start talking about malice or behind the intent. That's such a dangerous, I guess, game to play. Like it's terrible to see. So, To
Yeah,
your point
maybe
earlier, go on, sorry.
Rupert Murdoch really, is a great guy. I'm just, uh,
I'll sound clip that. I'll cut that one out.
I want to make sure, I know you guys, because of any liability you might have, Rupert Murdoch is the kindest, most generous human. No, no,
Look,
I
if he
mean,
wants to take me on, Dr. Mann, he
villain.
can take me on. I'll see him in court.
I
It's
just
fine.
want to,
I'll
sorry.
cut you off there. Sorry, Dr. Mann, go on.
Yep. Oh, no, next, next question.
Perfect. Look, to your point earlier, that there is a lot of, I guess, doom and gloom, which is a sharp 180 from the media, right, over the last sort of decade of denial back into the doom and gloom. So, look, trying to put so much information of where we are today versus where we are a decade ago in a short time frame, it would be pretty easy for listeners to feel a bit down and out and almost helpless in the
Yeah.
current situation, right? So I guess if there was one thing that you'd want our listeners to take away from today's conversation, something that they could perhaps do, what's the best thing that the everyday man and woman could do today?
Yeah, no, I think you put your finger on it. Again, we've seen devastating impacts. I mean, how could you live through the Black Summer and not feel some, how could that not take an emotional toll? The stories about the koalas of New South Wales, and, it became, as I understand it, functionally extinct because of those wildfires. And maybe there's actually some hope there, but I mean, the impacts were devastating. The kangaroos, those images with the fires blazing behind, just the imagery that came out of that. And this isn't manufactured imagery. This isn't AI generated imagery. This is real imagery. It was a real dystopian nightmare that we saw play out in Australia. We've seen the same thing here in the US. So it's easy to understand how people can feel powerless. These changes are so large. The magnitude is so great. They're global in scale. How can we do anything about it? And it brings me back to the message of the book, which is really about what the science tells us. And there's the science that comes from the modeling that we do today. But there's also the information from sort of the record of past change that helps sort of address some of the uncertainties in the modeling. And when you bring it all together, what it tells us is that we can prevent more, we're already experiencing dangerous climate change. We're seeing it play out. So we're not going to avoid it. We're not going to avoid dangerous climate change, but we can prevent it from getting worse. We can keep, the planet within that sort of range of our adaptive capacity where, where things don't spin out of control, where there's consequences. There are already consequences. We're going to need to adapt and be more resilient in the face of those impacts that are now locked in. But we can prevent, truly catastrophic global scale civilization ending warming if we act now. And so the message, once again, it comes back to urgency. The urgency is obvious. We see it on our television screens now. We see it on our social media feeds. But the agency, we have to recognize that there's agency too. It's not too late. That's so critical because people have to understand, and this comes from the science, and that's the message of the book. This isn't just me being a Pollyanna or promoting hopium, as the critics, the doomers like to say. We're promoting hopium, no, this is what the science actually says. And that's what this book is about. What does the science tell us here? Not the opinion of, any one scientist or the, Joe Blow on the street, not just opinions, but hard data. And what does it tell us? And it tells us it's not too late. And so that's the message of the book. And it aligns, as it happens, with what my overall message has been for some time. Again, this message of urgency coupled with agency.
I love that. Dr. Mann, I've got one final question. Again, thank you very much for your time. We've got a tradition on the show. I've unashamedly stolen it from a different podcast called Diary of a CEO with a gentleman by the
Oh,
name of Stephen Bartlett, in which the previous guest asked a question for the following guest. So the question that's been left for yourself by the previous guest, Michelle Cozzi, who's a director of Elwyn. She's asked, what makes you keep turning up every day?
great question. Does she know who the next speaker is going to be?
No idea.
So
Blind.
it's a perfect question for what we're talking about here, right? And
Yeah,
we
yeah.
sort of it here. The fact that the science tells us that it's not too late to act, but more than that, I'm going to give two answers if that's allowed.
Please. Of course, yeah.
This is sort of on the scientific side, and that's the message of the book. The science tells us that it's not too late. That's what the record of Earth history tells us. But that's on the science. What about on the sort of sociological side of things? It's the kids, it's the young folks, it's the passion, the youth climate movement, the way it's changed the conversation, the articulate. It's just this amazingly articulate generation of change makers who are taking matters into their own hands. They're not going to wait until they're, of voting age or they're CEOs or what have you. They're making a difference now because they know it'll be too late if we wait until they're grown up in positions of power. And so that's what gives me optimism. That's what, it's that the combination of the understanding from the science, from being a scientist, that it's not too late, with the optimism that sort of the youth climate movement gives me, that gives me the energy to turn up day after day and try to communicate this message that it's not too late. As long as it's not too late, I'm going to be out there saying it's not too late, because the greatest threat at this point, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The only way that we sort of collapse in a climate death spiral is if we become convinced that it's too late to act when it's not. So that's my message, and that's the answer to that question.
That's brilliant. Dr. Michael Mann, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mann's book coming out, Our Fragile Moment, How Lessons from Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis. Go out and grab a copy of that brilliant book. Dr. Mann, where is the best place for
early
people?
October in Australia through Scribe books. Yeah.
Yep, excellent. And for people that want to learn more about the great work that you're doing, where's the best place that they can reach out and find you online?
Oh, it's really complicated. All right, get ready, because www.michaelmann.net.
I love it. Dr. Michael Mann, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the great work that you're doing. I can only speak for myself, I guess, but I guess I really appreciate it. I'm sure many others do.
Thank you for giving a voice to folks like me, and I'm looking forward to watching future episodes of the show.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Michael Mann. I'll hopefully speak to you soon.
Thanks.